Thus, lettrism, the avant-garde of the avant-garde, Issot began with poetry because as creation was the highest form of human activity, and art the highest form of creation, poetry was the highest form of art. He was, though, a crank with a sense of history and a fierce sense of publicity. He wasn't born Isidore Issot. He was born Jean Isidore Goldstein, just as his Romanian Jewish Dada forebear was born Sammy Rosenstock. Rosenstock gave himself the exciting new name Tristan Tzara, awarding himself a name almost as alliteratively memorable. Issot played chubby checker to Tzara's Fats Domino. That was not all. Issot was sexy in an androgynous manner, far ahead of its time. His lower lip was enormous, enticing. His mouth was all sensuality, all come on. His dark curls began in an elephant's trunk and ended in a proto-DA. In some early 50s photos, he looked amazingly like Tony Curtis, whose internationally right, cuddly delinquent face would appear on the Hollywood screen about the same time Issot gained his first taste of fame. So I suggested to Michelle Bernstein, as we stood in her living room before Guy Debord's first letterist metagraphic, quote, a fancy word for collage, end of quote, which featured a torn photo of Issot. No, she said, Elvis Presley. Issot's field of action may have been high art, his theories penumbratic. Physically, instinctively, he was a hound dog. Issot's own description of his invasion of Paris from his 1947 L'agrégation d'un nom et d'un messie, the making of a name, the making of a messiah, gives something of the flavor of his monomania. Hitting the city with a suitcase full of manuscripts and a letter of introduction to Jean Paulhan, in 1945 managing editor of the Gallimard Publishing House, Issot made straight for the offices of his, he was sure, patron-to-be. It being a Saturday, Paulhan was not in. Putting into effect his principle of the minimum and the maximum, derived from the mechanics of amplitude successalent life, meaning chisel-like, which I've just learned. Life, like art, had to be taken to extremes. Issot then claimed to be a Romanian journalist and demanded an interview with Gaston Gallimard himself. Once through the door, he abandoned the minimum and pressed the maximum, offering his book-length Introduction à une nouvelle poésie et à une nouvelle musique de Charles Baudelaire à Isidore Issot. Gallimard agreed to consider it. Paulhan read it, and according to Issot, expressed interest, though perhaps acknowledged receipt pops up between the lines. But no decision was forthcoming, and so Issot continues. He brought to bear his system of, quote, calculated impatience, end of quote, retrieved his manuscript, and began taking it to other publishers. This brought no results. It was only when Issot began to exploit his talent for publicity that he gained a foothold in Paris, and for that he needed disciples. His first was Gabriel Pomerand, whom he met at a canteen for Jewish refugees. Born Pomerans, Pomerand was an indigent 19-year-old devotee of the surrealist saint Lautréamont. After making common cause with Issot, he would style himself the, quote, cantor of lettrism, end of quote, and the, quote, saint of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, end of quote. Expelled by Issot from the lettrist movement in 1956, he became an opium addict. He killed himself in 1972. Impressed by the famous authors Issot claimed to have met, André Gide, Jean Cocteau, Pomerand agreed to double the membership of the lettrist crusade. In the dead of night, the two plastered the walls of the Latin Quarter with handbills denouncing socialist, realist, and surrealist poets as reactionary enemies of true creation. Nothing happened. They held a reading. Few took notice. Their chance for a coup came with Dada Trump's Dada serendipity, with the 21 January 1946 premiere of Tristan Tzara's play La Fuite, Flight, which was to be preceded by a lecture by former surrealist Michel Leiris. Tzara was Isso's hero, the father he had to kill, the false god, the perfect target. Isso and Pomerand rounded up everyone they knew and bought tickets. When Leiris began to expound on Dada, with Tzara seated in the audience, they stood up. We know about Dada. Leiris, tell us about something new. For example, Lettrism. Dada is dead. Lettrism has taken its place. Understandably, Leiris had no idea what they were talking about. The cries went on. Long live Lettrism. You're kidding. You've never heard of Lettrism? A shout came from the back of the room. Throw the Lettrists in the toilet. Rattled, Leiris broke off his talk and the play began. Afterward, Pomerand bowled his way onto the stage and demanded that the creator of an epical breakthrough in the arts, one Isidore Isso, be permitted to explain his theories and recite his letter poems. Isso stepped forward. Most of the audience walked out. A few people approached. Thus did Isso make the papers for the first time, and brilliantly. A front-page article in the left-wing daily Combat put Isso into headlines, quote, "The Lettrists shake up a reading on Tzara," end of quote. More publicity and more recruits followed, and on that basis, according to Isso, Gallimard finally offered a contract. According to the word on the street, Gallimard did so because Isso's followers threatened to burn down his offices. But such rumors were merely fuel for the fire. 6 months after his arrival in Paris as a nobody, Isso was on his way. Insisting on the maximum even before his book appeared, Isso began placing exclusive interviews with luminaries of literary Paris. Guide, Francois Mauriac, and others. That the conversations were entirely made up displeased the publication in which they ran. So Isso began his own, La Dictature Lettriste, the letterist dictatorship. There and gone with a single number, but the first of many lettrist reviews. Today, one has the luxury of taking the title as an effusion of simple puerility, or flat megalomania. In 1946, it was appalling. Every day, the papers were full of stories exposing Frenchmen who collaborated with the Nazis, with reports on unthinkable Nazi crimes and dispatches from the Nuremberg trials. In this context, the flaunting of the word dictatorship was worse than the punk celebration of the swastika, and it worked on the same levels. Isso's provocation was a way of getting attention. It was an argument that, in the world everyone accepted without questioning, one dictatorship had been replaced by another. It spoke for an authentic flirtation with the fascist abolition of limits. The result was more publicity and more adepts. Isso produced books on the theater, on himself, on love. The latter was La Mécanique des Femmes, The Mechanics of Women, which in 1949 made his name a password on the left bank. In his preface, Isso more or less dared the police to arrest him. The brochure was, in essence, a sex manual, announcing that he was sure the police would not arrest him. After all, hadn't he already issued a far more subversive manifesto, a call for a lettrist revolution? The Minister of the Interior took the bait. He banned the book and had Isso picked up. Hauled before a magistrate, Isso declared that his work made a useful contribution to the education of youth. The judge ignored the Socratic jibe and packed Isso off to a state psychiatrist. Meanwhile, The Mechanics of Women topped the black market charts. After hours at the Tableau, once Boris Vian's jazz band packed up, Sartre, Camus, and Merleau-Ponty had stumbled on home, and Juliette Greco vanished into the night. Pomerand mounted the tables, shook a tambourine, and recited letter poetry. He passed the hat among drunken tourists and turned the proceeds over to the Messiah. In the cafes, more serious work continued, submitting to the mechanics of invention, and thus, if one divined the rules correctly, making cultural history by definition, the lettrists pushed their post-Dada letter poetry into Estepurist poetry, a poetry of the final element, a proto-language based on linguistic particles, quote, that have no immediate meaning, where each element exists insofar as it allows one to imagine another element, which is either non-existent or possible, end of quote. A typically mathematical in Swan formula that soon produced extraordinary results. They replaced both visual art and narrative prose with metagraphics, later hypergraphics, a neo-hieroglyphics where sentences were interrupted or completed by pictures and vice versa, thus introducing into alphabetic writing not only the art of painting, but the graphics of all peoples or social categories past and present, as well as the graphics or anti-graphics of every individual imagination. I'm going to read that again because it was so good. They replaced both visual art and narrative prose with metagraphics, later hypergraphics, a neo-hieroglyphics where sentences were interrupted or completed by pictures and vice versa. Quote, thus introducing into alphabetic writing not only the art of painting, but the graphics of all peoples or social categories, past and present, as well as the graphics or anti-graphics of every individual imagination. In 1950, with his Saint Ghetto de Près, subtitled Grimoire, Book of Spells, or alternately gibberish, Pomerand raised the metagraphic to the level of a cosmic pun. It was a fabulous production. Every word was shifted by a picture, every picture subverted by a word, and what the situationists would call, quote, the insubordination of words, end of quote, was dramatized even in Pomerand's title. With the substitution of the word prets, loans, the neighborhood of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the lettrist stomping ground, the protagonist of the book became a place where people lived on borrowed time. With the substitution of the word ghetto, it became a place no one could leave. But as one turns the pages, the neighborhood becomes a labyrinth where every chance encounter with a word, a picture, a building, or a person seethes with legend and possibility, opening into a secret utopia accessible to anyone capable of recognizing it. Quote, Saint-Germain-des-Prés is a ghetto, Pomerand began. Everyone there wears a yellow star over his heart. Saint-Germain-des-Prés is a mirror of heaven. As the years went on, the lettrists replaced poetry, music, dance, the novel, philosophy, theater, cinema, architecture, photography, theology. All will be gods, all will be masters. Radio, television, and video with new forms based on the same principles of particle physics that Issot first applied to poetry. They are doing it now as I write, still in their self-made ghetto, but in post-war Paris, the lettrists remained best known for replacing civility with noise. Because Raoul Hausmann had in fact invented letter poetry in Berlin after the First World War in 1968, past 70, Hausmann gave a demonstration, growling OFFEAHBDC/BDQ through a long speaking tube, then hefting it like a harpoon and high-stepping, finally hammering it to the floor. Quote, you don't think I remember this 1918 crap by heart, do you? End of quote. Issot and his followers attacked the originator as a plagiarist. To Hausmann's eternal bafflement and fury, though there survives a wondrous 1946 tape of Hausmann and various lettrists debating the question entirely through imaginary letter languages. It is said that in 1971, as Hausmann lay dying, Issot sent him a weekly letter, each containing only the repetition of a single word. Ordure, ordure, ordure. I have no idea what that means. I wish he would fucking say, but maybe it doesn't mean anything. The letrists attacked Gide, old bitch, faggot, and Isso's benefactor Paulin, the style of a toad. Andre Breton was savaged as a windbag leaking flabby rage, hysterically attempting to maintain his place in times that had passed him by. Quote, he offers himself and his generation to every faith, to every hope, to every boutique. One has learned not to be fooled, and there he stands, end of quote. Existentialism was dismissed as a pallid, vulgarized melange of Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger, and Jaspers. A not entirely inaccurate assessment. The culture war was on. Isso's declaration that his goal was to become God, but, he noted in 1958, without renouncing the pleasures of suspicion and skepticism, was not a joke. Neither was his claim that anyone else who created a new form could become God as well. Just as Dada called up millenarian ghosts, Isso too excavated the Gnostic belief that those who gathered around the truth, they and no one else, would become the gods of truth and inherit the earth. He was the Messiah, says Jean-Paul Courtet, today a doctor and a poet. In the late 1960s, a member of Isso's group. He promised paradise, that the economy would be a horn of plenty, art a continual excitement, life a wonder.